Certainly appreciate you sharing all your knowledge and experience with us.
It has been a pleasure. And thank you for the honor. Are these things on? With all the racket I made with them, maybe?
Try that.
Can you hear me now? No.
Let's move it up a little bit here.
Can you hear me now? Oh, yeah.
Try that.
All right. That's bound to work. So this morning, we talked about some economic reasons to make a change and the broad generalities of what you might change, like calving season and making sure you know what your resources are and all those sorts of things. We're going to get a little more to the nuts and bolts of actually making something happen this time. I'm going to start out talking about forage quality, because a lot of people's concern is that dead brown stuff standing out there in the field in the winter just isn't good enough. So we're going to talk about crude protein, digestibility, rumen function. We're going to spend quite a bit of time on rumen function, which is related to the balance of energy and protein in the rumen. We're going to talk about the role of selective grazing in maintaining quality through the winter. And we're going to talk about the good, the bad, and the ugly. So we're going to collect some forage, and we're going to send it to a lab to get an analysis. One of the things on the sheet of paper is going to be crude protein. When that goes to the lab, they don't extract protein molecules out of that ground up forage. All they do is measure total nitrogen, and then because the average protein molecule contains about 16% nitrogen, we just take the total nitrogen, multiply by 6.25, that's what crude protein is. It can include nitrates, nitrites, ammonium contained in the plant, besides true protein. If we were talking about our diet, a pig, a dog, monogastrics, we cannot use nitrates, nitrites, and things like that to make protein. If we eat too much of that stuff, it's going to kill us. So actually, if we eat very much of that stuff, it might kill us. So ruminants, though, because remember what we're feeding, a ruminant has this huge population of microbes in the rumen. And what we're actually feeding is those microbes. And those microbes can take any of these forms of nitrogen and convert it into amino acids and then into proteins. So feeding ruminants is different, but that's what crude protein is. When we think about energy, it's based on the digestibility of the fiber. You know, that's the great advantage that ruminants have, is they can ferment fiber in the rumen and pull energy out of it. DMD, dry matter digestibility. There's different ways of measuring it in a live animal and an artificial rumen, or calculating it from a fiber measurement, or doing the near-infrared reflectance. The numbers all come out about the same. That's our estimate of energy. What I want to think about now is the ratio of energy to protein in the rumen. And from here on out, we're just going to either say DMD or TDN is another expression, total digestible nutrients. Similar concept, but if we want to have a healthy functioning rumen, we want the ratio of that measurement of digestibility to be, compared to crude protein, to be between 4 and 6. So the DMD number should be at least 4 times bigger than the protein number, up to 6 times bigger. The lower ratio is for producing animals, the higher ratio for animals at maintenance. Now, can we live with a 3? Yeah, we can live with a 3. Can we live with a 7? Yeah, we can live with a 7. But ideally, we'd like to be in that 4 to 6 range. How do you take samples, and what do they mean? The most useless of all forage samples is the one agronomists do the most, and that's clipping the whole plant. Do grazing animals graze the entire plant? Not very often. They pick, they choose, and so a whole plant sample where you actually take the little metal frame out there, cut everything down at ground level or at 1 inch that is just telling you what is the absolute worst that this forage could possibly be. Because cattle, sheep, bison, elk are all very good at selective grazing, they can just pick out the best of what they want. And so if we look at what an animal actually consumes compared to a whole plant sample, it's probably going to be 3 to 5% higher in crude protein and 7 to 10% higher in digestibility. Cows are very good at being cows. They know how to pick the best feed out there. So since that's pretty useless, particularly if we're in a grazing situation, we do what we call an imitation grab sample. And in this method, we go out and we watch what the animals are grazing, and we try to do our best job of plucking the plant parts and the type of plants that the animals are grazing. If you're very good at this, you can get close to what the animal's doing, maybe within 1% crude protein, 3% TDN. If you're not very good at it, you're still going to be quite a ways off. Now, how do we know what an animal actually eats? It's with the holy cows. This is where we have the porthole in the side of the cow, and if you want to know what a cow is actually eating, you open up the side of the rumen and you reach in and you pull out a handful. That's pretty darn good representation of what a cow eats. It stinks. It's messy. It's expensive to have cows like these around. It's a tedious job. You don't want to do this. But this is how we know how these different types of sampling compare to what the animal actually eats. So always remember, when you take a forage sample, any way you collect it in the field, basically it's going to represent the worst case scenario of what the animal might eat. It isn't really what they're eating. So what are the requirements? Here's just a basic table for cattle of what the appropriate crude protein and TDN ranges are. Dry pregnant cow at maintenance, 6 to 7% crude protein. Now there's Western cows who do a pretty good job of surviving on 5 to 5.5%. They never read the book. There's other cows that don't really hold together as well as they should at 7%. So there's outliers, but basically if we have forage between 6 and 7% and a TDN of 51 to 53%, we can maintain a dry pregnant cow on that. As we ask that cow to produce, the requirement's going to go up. At peak lactation, and I'm looking at low to moderate milk producing cows. I don't need super high milk producing beef cows because every drop of milk comes at a cost. And you can put too much cost in a cow by having too much milking ability out there. I don't know if I've offended anyone lately, but I don't think there's a beef cow herd in this country that needs one more incremental increase in milk production. Most of us have plenty, and in a lot of cases, more than what we need. So I'm in my low to moderate milk producing cow, 8 to 9% crude protein, 60% TDN, that's at peak lactation. As lactation is declining, the requirement drops off. Stockers at 1.5 pounds a day, 9 to 10% protein, 58 to 60. Do we sometimes see a response bumping that up to 12? Sometimes we do, but this is what NRC tells us. Stockers at 2.5 pounds per day, these would be the pasture finishing animals. If we're getting that kind of gain, they're going to marble, they're going to lay down fat, they're going to be okay for eating. 11 to 12% protein, 68 to 70% TDN, and then we have the lactating dairy cows up there even higher. So that's what the basic requirements look like. Kind of keep those numbers in general in mind. Should you take forage samples in the summertime during the active growing season? To me, it's a complete waste of time because pasture is almost always going to be good enough in the summertime. So here's one. 4.6 is what the ratio is, 64 over 14. Just perfect. That's where we need it. I think we can, in general, look at that and say, you know, that's going to work. Why take a sample? It's when we get into the dormant season grazing that sampling becomes important. Can pasture be too good? Dairy farmers look at something like this, that nice little legume growth coming, lush grass, and they think, man, I could make milk on that. And cows will make milk on forage of this quality, 72% digestibility, 24% protein. The ratio, therefore, is 3, below the optimal range. Is there something that we could, I mean, that's super high quality pasture. How often do we think about supplementing super high quality pasture? Not too often, but could we get more value out of this pasture feeding some kind of supplement? And if so, what would that supplement be? What would it look like? Plain yellow corn. In general, plain yellow corn is not a good supplement for pasture, particularly low quality pasture. Counterintuitively, on something like this, corn is a good supplement. You've probably heard, well, they came around and said if you feed corn, it's going to change the rumen microbes and they won't be able to digest fiber anymore. Well, it doesn't take much of a microbial population to digest that forage. Putting in a limited amount of corn is going to allow the rumen bugs to capture a lot more utility out of that high level of protein. And because we're already in a very high digestibility situation, it's not going to alter the digestibility of the forage. And so in the dairy farming situation, that is how we would try to supplement this. A low protein content, high starch content supplement will give us benefit. Yeah, a beef producer probably isn't going to want to just throw corn out on that. What could a beef producer or a sheep producer do in this situation? Roll of hay. Medium quality grass hay, say some orchard grass hay at 9% crude protein, 58%, 60% TDN. That would be a usable supplement in this situation. But we're really not interested in this situation. We're interested in the dormant season feed, right? Because that's what we've been talking about. So let's think about, well, how good or how bad is this stuff and how might we supplement it? This is a data set from the Meat Animal Research Center at Clay Center, Nebraska, USDA's flagship beef research facility in the country. And you can see we have samples taken in November and samples taken in January for some different types of pasture. Now, tall fescue has been talked about a lot today, has stockpiled forage, and people have said it's pretty good quality. 10% crude protein, didn't change much from November to January. TDN in the mid-60s. Is that good enough for a dry pregnant cow? You remember what the numbers were? 6 to 7% crude protein and 51 to 53% TDN. This is good enough for the lactating cow. And if it's a low to moderate milking cow, it's good enough for peak lactation. Stockpiled fescue in the wintertime. Big blue stem, native tall grass, warm season grass, grazed through the spring and early summer, and then allowed to stockpile from July on, so it's regrowth material. And warm season grasses almost always have a lower protein than do cool season grasses, so predictably we have a lower protein. Now, I have no explanation why the November sample would be lower quality than the January sample. That's what we call sampling error, and sometimes you get it. The same individual did all of these samplings. So if we looked at this 5.1 and 56.1, the ratio is 11. That tells us these animals need a protein supplement. This by itself is not good enough for maintenance of a dry pregnant cow, but there's enough energy potential in the fiber that if the rumen microbes receive some more nitrogen, either as non-protein nitrogen or as true protein, they would be able to extract that additional energy out of it. And so this is still, with a little bit of supplementation, it's a maintenance quality feed for a dry pregnant cow. This brome grass regrowth, never in my life, in any sampling, other sampling I've ever seen, have I ever seen smooth brome grass with protein levels that high in the winter. it was fertilized with nitrogen, and that would be a factor there. But if we look at that, you ought to be able to get about 2 pounds a day gain on stockers on stockpile like that. Mixed regrowth, you know what? Good enough. Orchard grass, you know what? Good enough. Almost everything we're looking at here is at least good enough for a dry pregnant cow, and in many cases for a lactating cow or stockers at some level of growth. The one real bad one we have down here is mature big blue stem, and this is a whole plant sample. These others are all plucked samples. This is a whole plant sample, so again, it's the picture of the worst possible scenario. We've got about a 3% protein average. The TDN is actually below the potential requirement for the dry pregnant cow. The energy protein ratio is way out of whack. So we can say, okay, let's feed a protein supplement. And so we get the microbes working a little bit more, but even if you have ample protein in the rumen, the energy content is still not good enough. So in this situation, we would need to feed a supplement that provides both energy and protein, because the bugs can't get enough out of this real mature fiber to be enough. There, you know, we always, and in all due respect to our sponsors, we always tell about the feed salesman. You know, the feed salesman that goes driving up and down the road and he stops in at your place and says, you know, those your cows in the pasture out there, they look like they could stand some protein. And so he sells you some kind of a lick tub or blocks or something, and you put it out there. Who did the forage test on that? It might be dry, brown, dead-looking grass, the fescue, the orchard grass, the mixed pasture. You know what? The protein was good enough. Don't get into feeding protein supplements because it's what they do in the neighborhood, because somebody driving by said it looked like you could do it. If you're going to get into winter grazing, protein supplementation, actually do some forage sampling and base it on what's really needed. So that was Nebraska. And you might say, well, what relevance does that have here in Virginia? It's a completely different environment. Yesterday, our producer-presenter was Peter Hostetler from Rockingham County, and guess what? Peter has a nice set of data that he's collected from his pastures in Virginia, looking at, here's your sample dates. So he's gone through most of the winter, November, January, February, into March, stockpiled tall fescue. Look at those protein contents. Nowhere in the winter do we reach a level that would require protein supplementation. Look at those TDNs. Nowhere, even at 52.4 here on March 22nd, there's probably green grass just starting to want to come up through that. At the very tail end of winter, the energy content of the stockpiled fescue has finally gotten down into the range where, oh, it's still okay for a dry pregnant cow. And remember, the cow is going to select something even better than this. These are the samples that he collected, saying, oh, this is what the cow's probably eating, but the cow's still going to do better. So in every case here, every month of the winter, it was more than enough for a dry pregnant spring calving cow. Even looking at those, that is lactation quality feed for a fall calving cow. In Missouri, at the research station, last 2 years I was there, we ran fall calving cows through the entire winter, one winter with not a bite of hay the entire winter. The other winter, we had an ice storm on January 31st, and we fed supplemental hay for 2 days. And that's all the hay those fall calving cows had. It can be done. It can be done on pretty simple pastures. You make the pasture more diverse, some more legumes in it, some other grasses, and it can be even more robust than this. And again, just a reminder, there's the level of needs that we're looking at. Stockpiled pasture, or the other point in that one, Here's his orchard grass hay, which it wasn't cut. It says early cut. It wasn't baled on November 16th. But almost through the entire winter, the stockpiled pasture is higher quality than the orchard grass hay. All right, so now we'll go to the bad end. How bad can pasture get and still be usable? We've got one here, and this is out west. This is some seeded range grasses, intermediate wheatgrass, crested wheatgrass. I think there's some wild rye in it, but it looks pretty ugly. And the test says it's pretty ugly. 48% digestibility, 4% crude protein, ratios 12. Does this remind you of anything that might be growing around here? Broom sedge. Yeah, broom sedge. I've seen samples of broom sedge that were in the lower 40s, but I've seen some up here in the upper 40s when it's that rusty red out there. Crude protein, maybe as low as 2.5%. Maybe as high as 6. So think about broom sedge a little bit. You were wondering where the good, the bad, and the ugly were coming from, right? Well, the fescues in a winter pasture, the fescue's the good, the greasy grass, crabgrass, things like that are the bad, and the broom sedge is the ugly. Does anybody in this room think that you can get cows to eat broom sedge in the wintertime? Here's a guy nodding his head. You've seen them. Okay, anybody else? Anybody seen that? All right. Now, you might say, but they can't possibly be getting much good out of it. Well, it depends. These animals need more protein, but we also see that they're going to need some additional energy also. This will need some kind of supplementation. Broom sedge will need some kind of supplementation. And we're going to talk about how to avoid doing some of that. All right, here's one of those questions. If you're going to feed a protein supplement to cattle or sheep, does it need to be fed every day? No. Because the rumen is a batch processing organ, you can actually just periodically throw some protein in it and get it going again and digesting fiber again. Most of the research will show feeding protein every 3 days is just as effective as feeding little protein every day. So we're going to hit them with a slug of protein every 3rd day rather than every day. Cuts down on some of your labor and things like that. How do we keep that rumen functioning every day? That's what we're trying to accomplish. Number one, we feed the rumen bugs first, and more often than not, protein or nitrogen is what we need to feed to them. The digestible substrate is that fiber, that plant material, and it can be pretty mature as long as we're putting adequate nitrogen with it. We feed the animal second. Most of the protein, or I won't say most, a good part of the protein that the animal uses extracting in the small intestine is dead microbes. It's microbial protein, not necessarily dead. It's microbial protein, not raw plant protein. Now, we can put raw plant protein down in there as bypass protein. We used to use some animal products, things like fish meal, as bypass protein. I don't hear people talk about bypass proteins too much anymore. They kind of had their surge, went by the wayside, so we're not going to talk about them. VFAs are volatile fatty acids. That's energy source that's absorbed directly out of the rumen. And then we have sugars, the product of starch breakdown, fiber breakdown, that go on into the lower stomach. But it is a two-stage feeding system. Feed the bugs first, feed the livestock second. Another concept that's important when it comes to winter grazing management is the idea of rate of passage. That simply means from how long does it take from when the cow bites off this stockpiled grass to where the waste product comes out the back end. That's determined primarily by, guess what? Fiber digestibility and nitrogen availability. How fast can the microbes process that stuff and get it to flow through? If you remember that super high quality grass legume mixture we had, that dairy pasture, that stuff will pass through the entire digestive tract in 12 to 18 hours. It's very digestible. There's no fiber, there's a low level of indigestible fiber in those plants, and so it doesn't back up in the rumen and take a long time to get through. When we get into some of these lower digestibility stockpiled forages, it's going to range 72 to 96 hours. That is about the maximum amount of time that we can have forage passing through the rumen and keep the animal alive. It can be resident in the rumen for 8 to 10 days, and if that's the case, the animal's going to die because they can't extract enough energy out of it to even meet maintenance requirements. You can have an animal, looks full, totally stuffed up, with forage and fall over dead from starvation if the rate of passage is too slow. Strategically, what we're going to try to do is keep that rate of passage in the 36 to 48 hour range. Might be a little longer than that, might be a little shorter than that, but if we can keep rate of passage into that time frame, we can keep the animal functioning and performing. So let's think about ways of putting more nitrogen into the rumen when you need it to be there. The first one we're going to talk about is change the way that they're grazing the pasture. Cows, let's see what's here. All right. This isn't made up numbers here. This is a 2,640 acre pasture, and we have put 400 cows in it. What's she going to eat on the first day out there? Whatever she wants. She's going to go through that whole area, and now the she that I'm using is this herd. These cows are going to, within the first day or two of being put out there in that 2,000 plus acre pasture, they're going to cover most of it, because what was the second line on the position description for a cow? Find the best bite of feed you can. And so she's going out looking for it, and she's taking it as she goes. We give the cow the opportunity to selectively graze, and she's going to only pick what she wants. The big question becomes, what's she going to eat on the 100th day that they're out there on that 2,000 acre pasture? And we could have had 40 cows on 100 acres or 9 cows on 23 acres. However you want to look at it, the pattern of behavior is the same and the result's the same. She's not going to eat nearly what she needs to because she's always taken the good stuff out. If we have this stockpiled pasture out there, and this is a mixed fescue native grass pasture back in Missouri, the animals, they're going through there, they've got their heads down, selecting out the best bite of feed that they can. And that best bite of feed is the highest protein material. They are protein hunters. They're head down, and they are finding that highest quality, best bite that they can. So the good plants quickly disappear, and we're left with a bunch of pencils out there, and cows can't digest pencils. So animals are going to, if we don't intervene, the animal's going to lose body condition, fail to breed in the spring, maybe die, and all those other things. You know what the fundamental problem is here? We're letting cows make management decisions. That is not in their position description. We're letting them make business decisions, because by allowing them to make these choices through the winter, they are dictating how much supplement's going to be fed, how many days of hay feeding we're going to have, and a whole bunch of other stuff. And they have no concept of profitability. They have no concept of doing the right thing. The only concept they have is, I'm going to be the best cow that I can. And that's what they're trying to do. We need to take away from them making those business decisions. So what if we got in control and we told them where they could be on what day and then allowed and then allowed them to eat in that area? That's what strip grazing is. It's taking business management away from cows. It's getting back in control. When we first started doing more intensive strip grazing at University of Missouri, I thought the primary thing we were doing it for was we just increased harvest efficiency. We did a 4-year winter grazing study where we gave cows either 14 days worth of feed, 7 days worth of feed, or 3 days worth of feed. And this isn't just, guessing and say, I think if I put the fence over there, that ought to feed them for a couple of weeks. This was clipping and measuring all the forage, weighing the cows, knowing what they weighed, knowing what production stage they were in, and calculating what their requirement should have been, putting the fences in with measuring wheels so we knew we were giving them just that amount. And at the end of the 4 years, if you averaged everything, what should have been a 14-day allowance, the animals typically were moved on days 9 or 10. The grass is gone. The cows are bawling. We got to move them. But the calculation said it should have been 14 days. But it's only 9. What happened? Well, think of the cow's house. The cow's house has a dining room. Oh, and it's got a bathroom, but they're the same room. And they've got a living room, and it's the same room. And they've got a bedroom, it's the same room. Every aspect of the cow's life takes place on the dinner plate. Other than those few days that you take them off to work them in the corral or something, everything the cow does, she does on the dinner plate. And after she lives on the dinner plate for a week or 10 days, she ain't going to eat that crap. And you have to move them. The 7-day allocation, we typically got 5 days of grazing out of it. The 3-day allocation, we got 3 days out. So at the end of it all, the 3-day strip provided 40% more grazing days per acre than did the 14-day strip. If by giving them 2 weeks at a time, you got 80 cow days per acre, that's actually a pretty good yield compared to some things we see around. But if you did it in 3-day increments and you got 40% more, that would be another 32 days. So that same acre that was giving you 80 grazing days per acre, 80 cow days, in 2-week intervals, it's going to give you 112 days if you strip graze it out. And that's pretty important. This is the level of move frequency to accomplish different levels of utilization. And this is temporal utilization rate, which means of the grass that's standing in the pasture today, how much are we going to harvest in this grazing event? If you move the fence every day and you've got stockpiled pasture or winter annual forages, we would expect to be able to harvest 80% of the standing biomass out there. If we move them every 3 days, we're going to lose about 10% harvest efficiency from crapping, bedding, trampling. If we move them once a week, it's going to drop down to about 60% and right on down. If you just turn them out and give them the whole field, about 40% of the available forage will actually get used by the grazing animal and still be able to maintain the performance target of the animal. Yes, you can utilize more of this forage, but you're going to have to do it with a protein supplement to allow them to utilize what they've left behind. And that costs money. All right, so eventually I came to realize that there's another very important role of strip grazing, and that's maintaining healthy rumen function. All right, we already know cattle will selectively graze given the opportunity. We give them the big area, they're going to pick out the good stuff and leave us with crap. We know that we have to provide protein to the rumen microbes so that they can utilize the fiber. We know that to keep them healthy and this forage moving through them so they can continue to eat and not stop up and die, we've got to keep that rate of passage to about 36 to 72 hours. We also know that supplementing with protein every 3 days is a good strategy. Just put that in the context of strip grazing. If you strip graze on a 3-day frequency, you're providing, the very act of strip grazing becomes protein supplementation. Because on the first day going into a new area, they're still going to selectively graze and they're still going to get a higher level of protein. Boom, that's your supplement. Couple more days, eating lower quality stuff, but you move them to a new strip, boom, they eat protein, gets the rumen going again. We can keep that rate of passage where it needs to be. We're doing the supplementation on a frequency that needs to be. Taking that 2,640 acre pasture where they put the 400 cows and converting that to strip grazing. Now, strip grazing on 2,600 acres is done a little differently than on 26 acres, but essentially that's what we did. We went from harvesting 7, and this is dry range country, so these numbers won't sound very impressive, but we went from harvesting 7.4 animal unit days per acre to 29 animal unit days per acre. That's a 4-fold increase in harvest efficiency of stock days. On that 2,600 acres, changing from turning them out to strip grazing it, saved that ranch $36,000 a year in hay feeding costs. We put 17.5 miles of 2-wire electric fence on that place. That's big scale strip grazing. 1 year's, and we did the material installation, everything, so we handed them an invoice for $33,000. 1 year's hay savings paid for that 17.5 miles of fence. And we can turn it down and do it on a smaller scale too. Okay, so let's think about this selective grazing a little bit more and other ramifications. Now, this is orchard grass alfalfa. It's in the growing season. What we're looking at is the daily intake as a percentage of body weight across the individual days of a 7-day grazing period. So we've put them into a pasture that by our calculations and measurements should have been enough to feed them adequately for 7 days. The first day in there, what can cows do? They can go and pick out the best bite they want. They got a lot to choose from, and they ate at over 4% of their body weight. Now I got ruminant nutrition colleagues there at the U of Mu who said, that's impossible. Your data has to be wrong. You're using the wrong techniques. You don't know how to measure intake, all those kinds of things. Well, doesn't it matter what she did the day before? And if the rumen, if she's been eating at a lower level for a couple of days and the rumen is emptied out, remember rate of passage 36 to 48 hours, yeah, she can really tank up and refill that rumen quickly in 1 day of grazing, especially if all she has to do is pick off the very highest quality plant tops. Well, the second day she eats less because she's more filled. There's less to choose from, and what is there to choose from is lower quality. So day 3 it goes down, day 4 it goes down, or day 4 it goes down. This red dashed line here, that is maintenance level. The last 3 weeks of this 7 days, she's essentially eating at maintenance. This is what we call a roller coaster diet. And a roller coaster diet is going to give you inconsistent performance. If you were a dairy farmer, and this is what your cows ate on different days of the week, what would your milk yield look like? Well, wouldn't it go kind of up and down like this? And if you did this, wouldn't we say, well, you're a lousy dairy farmer. You're not managing right. We might even suggest you were borderline stupid. All right, how about a feedlot? Let's go to the feedlot. Fill up the feed truck, dump a week's worth of feed in the bunks in front of the steers and say, boys, we'll see you next Monday, and go away. What would the performance of those cattle look like? Not very good. Not anything like if they were being fed each day or even 3 times during a single day. So we would say that feedlot operator is probably on the dumb side. Tell you a little story here. It's one of those St. Peter stories. St. Peter's been hanging around at the pearly gates for a long time, you know. And some people come up there. A wide diversity of people. Some of them are on the dumb side. Some of them are pretty smart. He's talked to a lot of some of the greatest geniuses of our age. And so here it is, one Tuesday morning, 3 guys are walking up the path coming to the pearly gates. And St. Peter, because he's talked to so many people, he can have an intellectual conversation with anybody about almost anything. And so this first guy comes to the gate and St. Peter says, say, what was your IQ? And the guy says, well, it's 143. So, oh, you're a pretty bright guy. What did you do? He was an astrophysicist for NASA, and he's the guy who landed the rovers on Mars. And so they talk about, you know, deep space exploration and quantum physics and all those kinds of things. That's pretty good. He said, come on in, buddy. Make yourself to home. Second guy, he says, so what was your IQ? And the guy says, well, it's 173. Ooh, St. Peter asks, well, what did you do? And, well, I'm a molecular geneticist, and I'm the guy who discovered the link between the health of your gut and schizophrenia. Oh, by the way, this is absolutely true. Gut problems are not the result of mental disorders. Mental disorders are largely the problem of gut disorders. We've had that flow, that feedback flow backwards for many years. Oh, anyway, so this is what the guy was talking to St. Peter about. And, all right, come on in. That's great. We're happy to have you here. Next guy comes up. And St. Peter asks, well, what was your IQ? And he says, it was 82. And St. Peter says, oh, were you done calving before you died? All right, so we've established that it's dumb for a dairy farmer to run their feed regime this way. It's dumb for a feedlot operator to do it this way. Why is it okay for a cow-calf guy to do it this way? Huh. Think about that one. So, but this is just 1 week. It's in the growing season. It's orchard grass alfalfa. What does that really have to do with anything? Well, guess what? We also did it in the winter on stockpiled pasture. Now, this is a little different deal. What we're looking at here is the crude protein content of stockpiled tall fescue-legume pastures by 2-week intervals going from the end of the growing season to the beginning of the growing season next year. We have controlled grazing, and this would be the 3-day strip graze, and we have set stocking or continuous grazing. Now, one of my heroes when I was in graduate school in the early part of my career was a fellow named Roy Blazer. Anybody ever hear of Roy Blazer? I bet you have. One of the most prominent researchers in agronomy to ever be at Virginia Tech. He did a lot of good stuff. He did some of the stuff that I did in the 90s. Well, Roy Blazer done it in the 50s. You look at the old literature and say, oh, why am I bother doing this? Somebody else has already done the good stuff. So anyway, I had a great deal of respect for Dr. Blazer, but there was one thing that he maintained, and it's in his research publications, that I think he was dead flat wrong on. And there were a number of other scientists, contemporaries of his, that made the same mistake. And that was the claim that any stockpiled forage steadily declines in nutritional value through the winter. If you look at the the continuous grazing cattle, that's the pattern that you see. And most of Blazer's winter grazing work, and he was grazing stockpiled fescues in the 1950s, most of his work used continuous grazing as the winter management strategy. If you look at the controlled grazing And the change in protein, we really don't have a significant decline in the protein content until we get into the new year, February, end of January, beginning of February, and that's when we get our worst winter storms in Missouri, and then you have freeze, then you have thaw, and that's when we finally saw a decline in forage quality, but it still hasn't come down to the same level as the continuous grazing. That what they were calling a natural decline in forage quality as winter progresses is really nothing other than a reflection of the particular grazing management that was imposed. If you continuously graze, the animals will take out all the good stuff, leave you with the bad stuff, and leave you with the idea that forage just naturally decays over the winter. If you protect that from animal grazing and also the trampling damage and stirring of the canopy that allows frost to penetrate deeper into the plant canopy, you can maintain quality much, much, much later in the winter. So not only does strip grazing preserve the good, the bad, and the ugly, they'll eat it all together. I guess I wasn't going to have the picture I thought I was going to have. It'll come up. It's got to come up later, and we'll summarize this. Okay, so another way that we can get more nitrogen into the rumen is raise the protein content of what they're grazing. And guess what? Different classes of plants have different inherent protein and energy contents. The highest quality forage that we can have out there in the wintertime, both in terms of protein and available energy, are the winter annuals. Things like wheat, oats, annual ryegrass, crimson clover, arrowleaf clover, turnips. Those are high protein, high energy crops. Below those are the cool season perennials, with legumes having a higher protein content than the grasses. We have warm season annuals, Sudan grass, sorghum Sudan hybrids, pearl millet, crabgrass, and then the lowest quality that we have, or the lowest protein content we have of anything, are the warm season perennials. Bermuda grass, and remember I'm talking about in the dormant season, but it's largely true in the growing season too. But Bermuda grass, big blue stem, switchgrass, and broom sedge. So that's the ranking of how it goes. If you can get some winter annuals out there, they become a supplement to the pasture. This is December 30th, stockpiled tall fescue, 14% crude protein, annual ryegrass 18%. In this particular year, we grazed the annual ryegrass into February, the stockpiled fescue all the way through the winter. But if you have some 18% protein forage out there, if you could somehow control the animals eating just a little bit of that high protein stuff to supplement the somewhat lower protein stuff, hey, maybe that would work. So I want to talk now, this is supplemental protein. I want to talk about what we call limited access pasture. And this is not a new idea, but it's something, it's been done down on the Gulf Coast for years with Bermuda grass and annual ryegrass. This is again at the Meat Animal Research Center in central Nebraska. They have native rangeland and they have irrigated land. And so we've configured a wintering program here that uses the high quality irrigated forage, and this could be alfalfa swaths, or it could be like triticale oats, winter peas as a higher quality forage. You can think annual ryegrass, you can think oats. Anything that has a higher protein content will work for this. So we have this native range that has the proteins down in the 5% range, but adequate digestibility to provide the energy if we have the protein. So the way this system works is we set up a strip here, and these range strips are once a week moves, but every 3 days the cattle are allowed to come back in here for about 4 hours, and they fill up on that high quality feed that put the protein into the rumen, and then they come back out here. There's a stock tank here, and so it's very easy to move the livestock through the water blocks in and out. And that's how limited access pasture works. And then as the winter progresses, they just work down through these weekly strips, and then they'll do these ones coming back here. Next winter, that top pasture will be the one that's stockpiled for winter grazing. This will get used during the growing season. And then it'll be that one's turn. So they're rotating the winter use like I talked about this morning. Just another example from Kansas. This guy is a mixed crop and livestock farmer. Everything he does is no-till. They put a cover crop, a winter cover crop on their wheat fields because it's spring wheat. And the high-quality cover crop, the native grass adjacent to it, again moving through water blocks. A strip of the cover crop is the protein supplement for the native range grass. Feeding hay is a supplement. Alfalfa hay is a very good protein supplement that carries a nice energy supplement with it also. If we're feeding hay as a supplement, this is the way we typically do it, is we feed it on an electric fence. You can either, depending on how you're feeding, if you're unrolling a big bale, you can unroll a bale and then set your polywire fence right through that hay, and that keeps them from bedding on it, walking through it, forces them to line up along it and eat it. If you're doing little square bales, you can flake them off and put them under there. You know, I've been talking about doing protein supplementation every 3 days. You can do that with hay, but if it works out that you need 5 pounds of alfalfa hay every day to get the protein level that you need, that becomes 15 pounds fed at a bunch. And a lot of cows, particularly if it's cold, and you feed them 15 pounds of hay, they're going to eat that and then they're going to go lie down. And they might not be highly motivated to get up and go eat. And next morning, they hang around at the gate and say, man, is he going to bring me some of that good hay again? And so you disrupt the grazing cycle. If you're supplementing with hay, that is the one supplement that I actually prefer to feed on a daily basis. And I prefer to feed it in the afternoon because for almost all grazing animals, the time from immediately before sunrise to just after sunrise, that's when they're going to start grazing. Before sunrise when it's warm, after sunrise when it's cold, and then they're going to graze to mid-morning. Then they're going to lie down, ruminate. They'll take a couple more meals later, and so I don't want to upset that morning grazing pattern. So we feed supplements in the afternoon if we're going to feed a supplement. Pelleted feeds, cubes, things like that, can also be fed on the ground along electric fence. These are corn gluten pellets. One of our client ranches in, this one's in Idaho. But when you start thinking about supplementing on pasture and moving cattle and strip grazing, the idea of bunks becomes very inconvenient. Feeding on the ground like this, we eliminate the need for bunks, so we don't have that cost. We eliminate the need to be moving bunks along as the cattle move along. And you know, for 30 head of cattle, it's no big deal. 600 head of bunk space for 600 head, it's a different deal. Again, we already talked about our farm, the way we used it in the winter. What I want to get into now is specifically talking about strip grazing and the tools that we use for strip grazing. This is what I'm holding right there is basically what we use to replace tractors, mowers, rakes, balers. In the growing season, we use 3 units of temporary fence for each herd of animals. We have 2 fences set up containing the animals, 1 set up for the next move. Daily chores is open up this fence so the animals flow to the next strip, take the back fence down, leapfrog it up here to become the lead fence for tomorrow's move. So that's what the basic chores are. Depending on how wide your strips or how wide your grazing corridors or permanent paddocks are, dictates how many posts and what constitutes a unit here. The tools that we have found that we really like to use are geared reels. Anything built off the O'Brien patent we think is a pretty good reel. That would include the PowerFlex reel, the current Gallagher reel, though Gallagher's is only a 2.7 ratio rather than 3. But a geared reel built off the O'Brien patent are tools that we have found work real well. We've been using these reels since the late 1980s and have had very, very good success with them. As a step-in post, we really like the O'Brien step-in post. Now there's a lot of knockoffs on the O'Brien. We have yet to find anything that is as good a quality as a true O'Brien. I have posts, these are plastic posts, 3/16 inch high tensile rod is your step-in. I have posts that are over 15 years old, because the last time of my own personal post that I got a true O'Brien was 1994. So what are we up to? 19 years? The newest post that I have of my personal set of posts is 19 years old. Let me see what I got here. At this moment, well, it's a warm day in Patterson, Idaho. It's all the way up to 29. The other days that I've been giving this talk, it's usually been 7 or 11 or something. I can take an O'Brien post, bend it end to end at 0 degrees, and it'll come back up to its original position. That's how good O'Brien plastic is. They're easy to get in the ground. Do you just push them into frozen ground? No. You have to take the step and work it in a little bit, but you can get them in. Some people talk about using cordless drills and different things for putting a post in. I have been that close to thinking, well, I'm going to have to finally do that. But in 1987, 13, 25, in 25 to 26 years of using winter grazing with step-in posts, I have still never used anything other than the post itself to put it in the ground to get through the winter. When we first came onto the ranch in Idaho in the fall of '04, and we started strip grazing this field of barley, oats, and winter peas, and the pictures that you saw at the beginning of my talk, with the mountains in the back and the strip of the cattle, that's this field just a month later. But because there's no infrastructure on this 300-acre pivot, every strip of fence that we ran for strip grazing was over half a mile long. That is not much fun, because you have to use the bigger reels. It takes a lot more posts. And for the first 2 to 3 weeks we were there, every night the elk came off the mountains and knocked the fences down. But we put them back up, and it took us about 3 weeks to train the elk. And since that time, we've had almost no problem at all with the elk, deer, or antelope on our temporary fences. We had to use polytape for a while to train the antelope. But rather than saying, well, this doesn't work and give it up, we just found the right tools, the techniques to where we could get along with the wildlife. So if you're doing the longer stretches and you don't want to walk a half a mile plus cranking that reel, you can make a power winder, just a spool on a frame, put your cordless drill on it, and you can pull poly wire up. Recognize when you do this, it does shorten the life of your poly wire. The cheapest poly wire is going to suffer the most from doing this, and it might only last a year. A better grade of poly wire is going to last longer, and the braided material, the braided poly wires, this is not nearly as detrimental on a braided poly wire as it is on a twisted wire. We only use braided wires. Yeah, so what we needed to do, rather than for years and years and years having to move half a mile reels of fence, is we needed to change the infrastructure so that we could shorten those lengths. And that's what we did on the pivots. That's what we did in square land in Missouri. That's what our clients in rolling country do. We create these grazing corridors of parallel fences. On the pivots, they just happen to be round rather than straight. And so my daily chore is go out and move 1,000 feet of fence on the big pivot. That's for me to do strips, and recognize that I usually have 300 to 500 plus pairs or heifers and pair combination up there. So yeah, it's a little bigger scale, but I move 1,000 feet of fence day in, day out. It typically takes me somewhere between 20 and 25 minutes to take down that back fence, move it up to be the lead fence. And I've been doing this a while. I'm pretty good at it. Some of you know that back last summer I flipped a ATV over and broke my sternum and ribs and fractured vertebrae, separated shoulder and all that. And so about 2 months after that, I was back to working, and I wanted to see if I could still work at the same pace I did before, and I found I couldn't. I've gotten old, I'm broken. It was taking me 26 minutes. But when the cattle left around the beginning of December to go down to the lower ranch, I was back to 23, 24 minutes to do the fence switch out. And it's using the right tools and having a routine that you follow that gets you to that point. Okay, another concept that I want to use here is on these grazing corridors of making them of a particular width, as often as you can, try to make these things parallel. We moved away from doing a lot of block design type grazing cells to these corridors a number of years ago. And I have 435 foot shown as a width here. Anybody have any idea why I might like to use a width like 435? How many square feet in an acre? 43,560. So if you went in and put in, this will be a permanent high tensile fence. Each of these sides are either going to be your perimeter or a high tensile fence. If you put your posts in at 50 feet, and this is what I mean by permanent post, the space between each pair of posts is 1/2 an acre. So you can build an acre counter right into your fence system. You can take any width of corridor you want, come up with a corresponding post spacing that makes every pair of posts a known increment. So now, because you've done a pasture inventory and you've projected what your need is, you can sit in the warm, comfortable house and tell the kid to go out, move that fence 3 posts, and you know what the animals have been fed. It also allows you to count posts to see, well, how many more days of grazing do I have in here? And it makes record keeping much simpler. So when you're putting in fence, do a little forethought, plan ahead, build the accounting system into the fence, and you're going to be far more likely to do the records and the management. So 435 feet. At the research station, we had a lot of pastures set up at this scale. And 7 minutes is what it would take me to take down the fence, put it back up for a move. This is an illustration of a farm. I think this one's about 160 acres. It's in upstate New York. It's rolling land. It's not mountainous land, but it's rolling land. And you can see that we have laid out most of the farm in these parallel corridors. The red lines were existing fences, and then we've gone in there to create a infrastructure that allows much more intensive management. We created the grazing corridors. The blue lines are pipelines, and every couple hundred foot we have one of these quick coupler valves installed. I think in JB's presentation you would have seen the little valve with the yellow cap down in the pit. That's what we have out there. And so he's using a movable tank. There are some permanent watering sites out here for winter use. Remember, in wintertime, you don't have to be as close to water. They don't need as much water, so we don't have to have every watering point on the place as a winter usable water. The summertime, it's the movables, and so the strips, the temporary fences will be set up across here to create the strips, and you're just leapfrogging fences, moving the water tanks as they go. Now, Greg this morning talking about the time required for moves, he moves tanks. All of our tanks are permanent, so I don't move water. That's part of my competitive advantage there, is I'm not moving a tank. When you also have to move a tank as well as the fences, then it is going to take some additional time. But you can take any shape of property, any location, any contour, and create these grazing corridors. I just finished doing a system in the Sandhills of Nebraska where our corridors are 3 to 3.5 miles long and 1/4 mile wide. And it'll work exactly like this, except on a much larger scale with a larger herd. So there's the sum up. The power strip grazing. We can preserve winter feed volume, the amount of feed you have, much further into the winter. We can preserve forage quality deeper into the winter. If you have more feed, better feed, it's going to improve animal condition, elevate overall performance for when they do start calving, or if you have a fall calving system. So I'm going to end at this point, and we got questions, comments, discussion time.
Got some questions for Jim? Your last chance, we're going to Blackstone tonight.
Yes, sir, way in the back. Let me come to where I can hear you. Mm-hmm. Okay. Okay. The question was, if you are moving your watering points, does that have a bearing on fly control? Of course, my flippant immediate answer is, why are you worrying about fly control? Pink eye. Is that a genetic factor? Probably. Failure to breed because they have too much of a fly load, is that a genetic factor? Yeah, probably. Again, in Missouri, we quit probably 7 or 8 years before we sold out and moved. We quit doing anything for fly control. You know, for years we did, everybody did it, and our entomologist at the university eventually concluded flies are part of the environment. You need to have cows that can live with them, because in the long term it's not cost effective to try to control flies. All right, now to come back to your specific question, as part of an overall management practice to reduce fly presence, does moving the water around reduce fly infestations? The answer is probably, in many cases, it does. And so to me, it's a reasonable strategy to use. That's one of the advantages of movable tanks. Another advantage of the movable tanks is you can reposition them and change the focus of animal traffic within an area to reduce the amount of trailing. On a smaller farm, the distance that you move the troughs, that you move the herd around, is not nearly as effective for breaking the fly hatch out and going back on the livestock as it is on a big scale. Go to that, the example I just had said about Nebraska, where our corridors are 3.5 miles long. You're moving the animals enough distance in a system like that that you will be moving them away from the fly hatch. If you're on 40 acres, 80 acres, 150 acres, the distance at which you move the flies, that you move the herd and the water, probably isn't going to do a great deal to disrupt the flies. Anything else? Yeah. If you break up the manure piles, would you minimize the hatch? Yes. There is some evidence that happens. To me, it comes back to the question of, well, what is it going to cost you to drag the pasture to do that, and is the benefit appropriate to the cost? If you take the whole package approach, that we're going to have genetically functional cattle that can cope with all these afflictions and stuff, most of those tasks that we think about, these things that we think, well, we've got to do that, they go away. Anything else? Yeah, let me go back here and I'll get back to you. Yeah.
What type of residual are you leaving after you strip graze? Is there any correlation to how quickly you
Okay. The question is, what kind of residual are we leaving after strip grazing, and is there a correlation to spring growth? On tall fescue dominant pastures, I am perfectly willing to take it down to 1.5 to 2 inches. because the fescue is still going to do just fine. If you're into more of a mixed pasture, you got some orchard grass in it, some legumes, maybe some native grasses coming back in, I would prefer to see us leaving a 3-inch residual. If we take it shorter than that, we will impact spring growth. On annual pastures, depending on whether they're ones you expect to regrow in the spring and reuse, let me put it this, on the last pass of grazing on an annual pasture, I'm perfectly willing to pool table it because I'm not expecting it to come back. I take all of that growth off, and if I'm going to put like a warm season annual into it or something, or maybe I'm going to no-till drill a new perennial pasture mix, I want as little of that residual from the annual crop left behind as possible. And yeah.
Virginia's done a lot of research on deworming cows, and they can't prove it pays. What's your opinion on that?
The comment was Virginia has done a lot of research on deworming adult cows and says it doesn't pay. Bob Corwin was our parasitologist, and he arrived at basically the same conclusion, except he drew a line. And the line in Missouri was the Missouri River, which is essentially cutting it in half. He had evidence that south of the river let me back that off. On adult cows, nowhere in Missouri did he think there was a benefit to worming adult cattle. North of the Missouri River, if you were doing everything else right, there was probably no need to deworm yearling cattle either. South of the river, because of the higher heat and higher humidity and typically more stress down there, it still paid to deworm yearling cattle south of the river. In Virginia, I would guess that the state splits more along the mountain, probably in the southeast Piedmont. You're more likely to need to deworm some cattle. As you get further into the mountains, probably less likely to.
So the gist of your program is you can stay away from ag business people, you can make a living on.
What's the question?
I'm thinking of whether I want to tactfully answer this or not. I think we've run out of time.